Good morning, buenos dias. In Lakesh, Ubuntu, Namaste. It's really a pleasure for me to be back at Naropa, an institution that I hold near and dear to my heart. I do want to express appreciation to Giovannina and, of course, to Charlotta, who worked on so many details and just to get me here. And so it's great to be back. My talk today is one that I have been working on. It represents really a little bit of my evolved thinking from the last time that I was here. And it's about how do we connect contemplative education more intentionally with the issues of social justice. I am delivering this talk today at a time that our nation feels terrorized, that a large part of our population lives in fear. When transgender students have to think about even which bathroom they can use. When the Jewish community is terrorized by threats to its community. There's a whole long list of issues that appear almost on a day-to-day basis in our nation today. Women's rights, Standing Rock and the rights of Native people, violence against people of color, Black Lives Matter, and it goes on and on. And a key message that I have for all of us today is that the contemplative education movement is incomplete without the centering of social justice. But how do we do this in a more thoughtful way? Let me begin a little bit with how I enter this space of inquiry as a Latina, as a person who was born in poverty but now leads a privileged lifestyle, as someone who knows what it's like to be the other, Mexican, American, border woman, queer scholar, dark hair. It used to be dark. Brown skin, still there. Able-bodied and spiritual. And all of these intersecting identities shape who I am and how others react to me and how I shape my thinking and my work. And I've realized that despite all the privileges that I have with a doctorate and, middle-class lifestyle and all of that I can still stand at the margins of society. I can still be racially profiled. I can still be asked at the border whether I belong here. I can still experience a lot of the fear that many of our fellow citizens experience. So let me begin with this beautiful quote by feminist theorist Gloria Anzaldúa. And Gloria was a writer in the 90s. She passed away about 5 or 6 years ago. And she writes that a form of spiritual inquiry, conocimiento is an enlightened knowledge, a deeper knowledge, conocimiento. And she says that conocimiento is reached via creative arts. She didn't have the term contemplative practices at the time, but she talks about how this enlightenment can be reached through writing, through art, through dancing, through healing, through teaching, through meditation, and spiritual activism. In other words, what Gloria is communicating is that these diverse forms of contemplative practices are the ones that help us to reach enlightenment but that in itself is not enough. That enlightenment and that strength that we gain is to be used to help society. It's to be used for spiritual activism. It's to be used to remove suffering and pain and fear from the world. In much the same way, Thich Nhat Hanh talks about compassion-based social change, and he says that engaged Buddhism is just Buddhism. But when bombs begin to fall on people, you cannot stay in the meditation hall all of the time. So we have to get out there. We have to get out there, and sometimes those conditions are harsh. Those times, those conditions shake us up. Those times, those conditions throw us out of balance. So I know that there's a few in here that are still learning about contemplative education. And so for those, so we are all on the same page, I want to define contemplative education. So there's 3 critical elements that I looked at the Naropa website. It has rigorous academics, and that's paired with contemplative practices and experiential learning. The Center for Contemplative Mind and Society talks about contemplative practices as quieting the mind to cultivate a personal capacity for deep concentration and insight. And there's many forms of contemplative practices, some of which you engaged in this morning. And they have a tree of contemplative practices that many of you are familiar with, and just as diverse forms of practice. So I have come to understand the importance of a transformed vision of contemplative education that centers social justice. And the whole notion that contemplative practices only for the purpose of self-awareness, for stress reduction, and for feeling good, while important, are not enough. That we must use these tools of enlightenment to work on social change. And that contemplative education is key to raising awareness about social justice issues and about what Paulo Freire says in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, to recognize an inequity and to take action to remediate it. So with that said, I tried to put together a framework for doing this work of centering social justice within the contemplative education movement. And the framework is, for now, divided into 4 parts. It would have, for example, a lens rooted in social justice. And those lenses could be theoretical, philosophical, spiritual. For example, the theory of intersectionality, the theory of cognitive justice, liberatory pedagogy, critical race theory, feminist theory, engaged Buddhism. Those are just some examples. There would be many more. Then we would need to think about the learning objectives that we wish to work on. And they would be both academic and holistic and justice-focused. A third aspect of this contemplative education framework would be the use of the pedagogic tools. And we would employ a diverse array of contemplative practices, as well as tools to foster rigorous academic learning. And then we would look at what are the outcomes that we wish to see in students, both academic outcomes, social-emotional outcomes, inner life skills, and justice-focused outcomes. So let me give you an example of how this would actually play out in a teaching and learning environment. Let's take, for example, the theory of intersectionality that was developed by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. And basically she's saying that cultural patterns of oppression are interrelated and influenced by intersectional systems of society. And that all of us have these multiple identities that intersect to make us whole: race, gender, religion, ability, ethnicity, etc. So I found this very short video that basically gives us a sense of what this theory of intersectionalities is about.
Overlapping social categories, I see colorful pasta intertwined to create mutually constructed identities. I see runners on a track, obstacles set in front of them on the basis of their race and gender. I see privilege and the power to oppress. I see the multi-layered oppression of African American women. I see gender, race, class, and sexuality, a checklist of categories that places us within this patriarchal hierarchy that we call the world. But when I translate this to the world around me, I don't see intersectionality. I see the media portraying white, middle-class, heterosexual men and women as humanity. I see politicians claiming neutral politics that serve a fictitious majority. I see a public space filled with institutions that were built to serve the hegemonic masculinity and oppress the other. I see centers of knowledge production operated by white men claiming objectivity. Where are the people of color? Where are those outside of the heteronormative framework? Where are the colonized? Where are disabled people? Where is the proletariat? This is what needs to be seen. This is what needs to be made visible. This is the voice that needs to be heard. This is the call for collective subjectivity, which will reshape political, social, and economic structures of oppression and exclusion, which will unmask the identity of the neutral citizen as a white, middle-class, heterosexual man, which will show that his privilege is built upon the exploitation and othering of the marginalized. But how can the concept of intersectionality be more than a buzzword, more than a checklist of static identity categories, instead something that is used as a methodology that takes into account complex forms of discrimination shaped by history and social structures? And what does intersectionality mean for me, as a white, middle-class American woman, an academic, a feminist, a bearer of privilege, trying to understand the ways in which I reproduce systems of oppression so that I might be part of deconstructing it? It means that I am not humanity, I am not women, I am not objective. I am a standpoint in solidarity with and recognition of society's many unique, lived, and complex identities. In the words of Adrienne Rich, we are, I am, you are. By cowardice or courage, the ones who find our way back to the scene carrying a knife, a camera, a book of myths in which our names do not appear.
So, why the theory of intersectionality in connection with contemplative education? I believe that learners need a theoretical anchor in which they can face themselves in all of their complexities. And they need a theoretical anchor with which they can face humanity in all of its complexities. So let me give you an example of perhaps a classroom where it's focusing on a particular social justice topic, for example, violence against people of color. And there's lots of violence, from police brutality to murders, to the killings of worshipers in this church in South Carolina by white supremacists who believed that only white people had a right to live in this world. And so, in this particular example, the intersectionality lens could be used to help us see ourselves and others. It could be used to recognize diverse social identities and to recognize that people of color can experience, for example, racism, sexism, and homophobia all at the same time. And it would recognize the privileges associated with whiteness and white supremacy. We would pair that with contemplative tools that would help us to gain a deeper awareness of ourselves and of others, and that would help us to approach these kinds of terrible social justice situations with greater skill, wisdom, and compassion. Let me give you another example using the lens of cognitive justice, which goes hand in hand with intersectionality. Basically, cognitive justice is about appreciating diverse ways of knowing, that there is more than one way, more than one knowledge that goes beyond the Western paradigm. It is multi-voiced. It recognizes that knowledge and insights can come from diverse perspectives. And it decolonizes Western ways of knowledge. So, coming back to an example in the classroom and how that lens could be used, in a social justice education class, the cognitive justice lens would allow us to see that content and curriculum can be inclusive and multi-voiced, that Western ways of knowing can coexist with others, and that they can be critiqued and discentered and placed among other forms of knowledge. And then we would bring in the contemplative tools to help us to engage with diverse forms of contemplative practices, not just that are traditional, but also those that are aligned with those individuals from diverse cultures. I give this example, even looking at the Latino community, and many low-income schools, for example, in South Texas, where I'm from, don't really do anything with contemplative education in the way that you know it. But people of color have had contemplative traditions for a long time. We might not start our lives doing Tai Chi or Qigong or even meditation, but we know prayer, we know dance, we build altars, we can write poetry. So these are other forms of contemplative practices that are aligned with culturally diverse learners, and those too are important, and we need to keep those in mind when working with diverse populations who look different than us. At the same time, I think we need to keep in mind some important, what I call pedagogic considerations. And beginning with the notion that contemplative practices are the key tool for engaging students in deep learning. And, you know, it's interesting because I was just at CU yesterday and I was talking about deep learning, and, you know, most of the people at CU, for some reason, even though they're your neighbors, don't understand contemplative education. And so it's nice that they invited me to talk a little bit about that. And so I was telling them that right now, for example, the Association for the American Association of Colleges and Universities is advocating deep learning as a high-impact practice. But it doesn't talk about contemplative education, it just says deep learning. So we need to get in there and say contemplative education is deep learning. It is how we gain enlightenment. It is how learners can engage more deeply in the learning experience. On the other hand, we also need to be aware that there are some shadow aspects about this work. One of them is, to what extent do these practices serve only to close down tensions? Are they conflict averse? Is the intent to console and make learners, especially privileged people, feel good? And to what extent are contemplative practices excluding the cultural traditions of oppressed student groups? There are some important outcomes that are related to contemplative education that we need to think more deeply about. And as I thought about the outcomes that we wish to see, we all know the academic outcomes, and we want everybody to be good writers and develop problem-solving skills, critical thinking, etc. But we need to be very intentional about writing down what are the outcomes of contemplative education. For example, altruism, giving back to our communities. So many students have this particular strength, and we need to bring it out with contemplative tools. A sense of connectedness, activism, a sense of compassion and patience, a sense of meaning and purpose, self-knowledge, empathy, appreciation and work with diversity, pluriversality that moves us away from either or black and white thinking to consider that, everything is connected. Self-care. And so I want to turn now to giving you some specific examples of teaching and learning environments where social justice is centered. And I want to begin with one that is connected to helping students to find their voice, helping students to write and to find their voice, particularly students from low-income backgrounds, particularly students who grow up thinking they can't write, who are told you're not good enough, who are told you're not college material, but who have it within themselves, given the proper tools, to be excellent writers. And so I was watching this beautiful documentary. It's called Louder Than a Bomb, and it depicts the world's largest youth poetry slam held in Chicago. And these low-income kids come and read and perform their poetry. And while they may not know it, they're using some beautiful contemplative tools such as performance and slam poetry. Let me give you an example of one particular student. Her name is Nova, and she reads a poem that she wrote called Apartment on Austin. See, Nova grew up as a little girl with her father, who was an addict, and her younger brother that she took care of. She actually took care of both her father and her younger brother, who was suffering from diabetes. So here's Nova performing her poem.
Grew up in a neighborhood where he got it bad from both sides, black people, white people, just because he was mixed. And as a result, because he grew up fighting, he grew up aggressive. And as a father, he was aggressive. When my parents got divorced, we thought that we didn't have to see him anymore. It turned out that we had to go there 4 out of 7 days of the week.
There are always sirens outside your place. Your condo always seemed to lean to the left. The cement windows rusted like overused water pipes. We lived on the first floor.
What she writes about is hardcore, raw stuff, and when she says it, she gets in that place. So when she's on stage, you're there with her.
Our condo door was tainted white, like a 3-year-old sock washed every week. The walls were the 49ers, and the carpet was rough, like tangled hair. Everything you had no room for piled onto shelf like children.
I fell into the caregiver role. I took care of him. I braided his hair before he went to work. I ironed his clothes. I woke him up before he went to work.
You would always ask me to make your drinks. Measure liquid with the width of my 9-year-old fingers, 4 finger sangria, 2 gin, 2 tonic, and 1 lemon juice.
I grew older and I said, I can't do this anymore. And so I left.
By the time I was 10, I was your wife, your sister, your mother, your best friend, and you were bitter. I would feed you chicken soup when you were sick, kiss your forehead to see how bad your fever was. But I'm 17 now, and we don't even talk. And sometimes I wish I could tell you how much I miss you. How I want to wrap my arms around your sunken stomach like tissue paper, that I love you. Wish that you were here to be my Papa G again, so you would know that I have a boyfriend that loves me more than you ever used to. But I guess you're too busy rusting like cement windows to notice that your baby girl is a woman. And how my memory will fade like your 4 finger sangria, 2 gin, 2 tonic, and 1 lemon juice.
My father and I haven't spoken since I was 12. And I feel like I've been trying so hard to just get rid of his memory. I just don't want to think about it anymore.
So we have to remember that students have strengths. That's what I'm going to talk tomorrow at the town hall. Regardless of background, students have strengths. And, you know, you see the strengths of this young lady who's able to express her truth in her own voice, who has her own sense of authenticity, who has courage, who has determination, who has persistence. I have no doubt that she will be successful in life. So, coming back to the framework that I proposed, the theoretical lens, let's say you're a teacher working with NOVA, would include, for example, intersectionality, that poetry can be written from diverse points of reference. It could also include a lens of cognitive justice where voice and experience count as knowledge, that these kids can bring in their knowledge, which is as good as what others bring to the teaching and learning context. And another lens could be liberatory pedagogy, where students are assisted to liberate themselves from all of this negativity that has been put into their heads, that they can't learn, that they can't express themselves. They liberate themselves to think that they too can be powerful learners. The learning objectives would be to create a context where low-income students can witness themselves as powerful learners and writers, to allow for healing and liberation, and again, to liberate students from self-limiting views. The pedagogic tools would be slam poetry, contemplative performance, and of course, the writing. And student development outcomes could include healing and personal development, empowerment, and of course, developing their writing skills. Let me give you another example. This is Professor Carlos Silvera, who teaches art at Cal State Long Beach. I interviewed Carlos for my book, Senti Pensante Pedagogy. Carlos has his students work on arts projects in community sites. He doesn't believe that art is just something to hang on the wall. I mean, that's all nice and good. He believes that art is a tool for social change. So some of the contemplative tools that he has used include community arts projects, service learning, journal writing, and visits to these community sites where social justice themes are highlighted. So here's Professor Silvera.
I think they have to be, first of all, humanitarians as teachers. They have to develop this sense of compassion nowadays that's extremely important in teaching. So, of course, the theory is extremely important in the classroom. But this other aspect that's somehow overlooked by a lot of teachers in education, that I think it's as powerful as the theory approach in the classroom. There's this beautiful story that Anita Patnaik from Panasastra University, she's from India, and she told me the story about Mother Teresa. Her sister worked with Mother Teresa, and the first day she was in one infirmary for people with leprosy, right? And they were so disfigured that this woman, it was her first day, she went to Mother Teresa crying. She just couldn't take it. She was just crying and saying, I'm supposed to feed them, but I don't know even where I should put the spoon. And Mother Teresa turned to her. She had a bad temper. Mother Teresa turned to her and said, do you see a hole in their faces? And she says, yeah, so stick the food in it. So this says so much about, she was tough. She was very direct. But the first thing that you have to forget when you are work in the community that sometimes in Cambodia we'll be facing a lot of situations that will be pretty tough, that we can cry and we can somehow, it's not about me. It's not about me feeling terribly sad, and it's not about me crying. It's about doing something about it.
So Carlos himself models this community service learning. He went to Brazil to the favelas. You know what favelas are? The shanty towns. There's a movie based on these favelas. It's called City of God, where these young kids grow up with guns and their lives are cut short. Many don't make it to even 20 because there's so much violence in these favelas. So Carlos went there to work with these kids. And some people would say, why are you going there? These kids can't learn. But Carlos would beg to differ. And so he worked with these kids, and here's a picture of them. They constructed this black-white angel, an anti-racist angel, to protect their communities. So display the angel very proudly. So they can do art. They can learn. So bringing it back to the framework, the theoretical lens that he uses is liberatory pedagogy. The learning objectives would include empowering students, addressing community social justice issues, engaging students in community service, and of course, he has them learn art theory. The pedagogic practices are community arts projects, service learning, journal writings, and visit to these community sites, and art theory. And for outcomes, again, he wants them to learn the theory, but he also wants them to be caring humanitarians and to be able to take action to address inequities. One more example. This is the example of Professor Alberto Pulido from the University of San Diego, who teaches ethnic studies. And some of you have heard me talk about the Cajita project, and I bring it here because I so love this project. And he wants his students to find this deeper sense of meaning and purpose, identity. And he wants to connect students to their communities. So he has them construct these cajitas, these boxes. For example, Day of the Dead, he would have students write an essay about a loved one who has passed away, but at the same time construct this box that has artifacts about this person and the meaning of this person in the students' lives. So here's Dr. Pulido.
So this box here was done by a student named Valerie Barra, and the title you can see on the top sheet. I usually ask students to write like a narrative, which the students here today did a great job in. And it's called My Life as a Mestiza, Valerie Barra. And the little that I know about it, the discussions that we had about it, was that she considers herself part Chicana and part Apache. And so when you look at the imagery in terms of the symbols, you see some of the traditional symbols that you would see in terms of being Mexicana or Chicana and that whole process. But then you see some of the Native American influence. And she did all these kind of different symbols around here. You can see, Christian symbols and Native American symbols. Up on top, which you can't get access to, there's an actual field of an agricultural field. There's an eagle that's been carved in. There's a horse. There's some Native American symbols as well. And I think it just captures what the students were talking about in terms of those dualities and living in those multiple worlds.
So again, bringing it back to the framework, the theoretical lens that he used is something he called situated contemplation, where he puts students in sites so that they see the history of the site, the political and cultural context to provide a deeper meaning and purpose. His learning objectives are really to help students to find that purpose, identity, and self-worth, to connect students to their community. And the pedagogic practices are arts-based and reflective tours to sites in their communities. And the outcomes include learning their community history, politics, and culture, understanding intergenerational knowledge, gaining empowerment, focusing on their identity, and gaining a critical awareness of self and the social context and working for social change. In my own classes, I have had students to work on their own Cajita projects. For example, I teach a class and student affairs practitioners, student people that are getting their masters who are going to work as student affairs staff. And this is a cajita that my former student at Iowa State, Vijay Kanagala, he's now a professor at the University of Vermont. And the story behind this suitcase as a cajita is that when I made the assignment, he said he didn't understand really what I wanted him to do. And one day, he saw this tattered suitcase, and he proceeded to go to the dumpster to just throw it away. His mother ran after him and said, "Don't throw that away." He said, "Why not?" And she goes, "Well, that is the suitcase that carried all of our belongings when we moved from India to the United States." And so that became his cajita. You see the artifacts in there, including that little sweater that he wore when his grandfather passed away and his grandfather was holding him. This young lady, Alicia, her cajita is this scarf that she wraps around her body. And she told me the story about how her grandmother, who lived in Liberia, went through this civil war in the 90s. And the women didn't know when the soldiers would come to attack the village. And they had to be ready to go at a moment's notice. And they would put all of these personal belongings in these scarves. And so to honor her grandmother, Alicia uses this scarf as her version of the cajita. There are many social justice topics that beg for our attention these days. Topics that ask us to think very deeply and profoundly about their impact on society. One of those is the border wall that I'm concerned about, having been born on the US-Mexico border. And I came across this very interesting series in the Washington Post. It's called Concrete Divisions, A New Age of Walls.
On day one, we will begin working on an impenetrable, physical, tall, powerful, beautiful southern border wall.
Where would you build it? Down the middle of the river? That's the border. You're going to build a wall on the border, it needs to be down the middle of the river.
If we can go to the moon, we can build a wall.
All of this building of the wall, it is a sign of the erosion of our democracy.
And so there's a lot of talk about the wall and the cost and all that, but many people don't know that right now there is a wall. There are fences that cover about 700 miles of that 2,000-mile border. And so here you see it.
Well, have you seen the wall?
Wait a minute. There we go. So this yellow highlighting here is where there's already some form of a wall. And there's some parts in Texas that don't have the wall, but down in what's known as the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, McAllen, Brownsville, there's a wall there. And that was a wall that George W. Bush constructed. I don't know what Trump wants to do, whether he wants to tear down what's already there. But this area of Texas up here by El Paso, the terrain there is very, very difficult to work with. So it's not going to be easy. It's going to cost billions of dollars, as we all know. But at any rate, I bring this to your attention because in a political science class, in a history class, in an English class, I mean, this project can be adapted to look at the whole issue of building walls and how they are often built to divide people. And so what would be the theoretical, philosophical, or spiritual lens that would center social justice in teaching this unit? What would be the learning objectives? What would be the contemplative tools that could be incorporated? And what would be the outcomes that we would seek in having students learn about about walls, and in particular, the border wall? So here's what I call an ecology of the different forms of contemplative practices. And you know, I think most of you are familiar with so many of them, from autoethnographies to meditation. We heard slam poetry, music, dance, drumming, guided imagery, films, service learning. Gloria Anzaldúa talks about how inner work can lead to public acts. And in this transformed vision of contemplative education, as I thought about it and what all it entails, one aspect is that it invites us to participate in a journey. And this is a journey to change ourselves, to rid ourselves of things that aren't working for us anymore, and to know that as we change, we can also act to change the world. This transformed vision that I propose promotes contemplative activism, that this inner work that strengthens us, that illuminates us, that gives us enlightenment, can be used to create change in our worlds. This transformed vision of contemplative education asks us to reinvent ourselves. But as we do so, we need to be ready for what Gloria Anzaldúa calls un arrebato, this jolt. This is hard work. This is work that is going to shake us up. And we need to ask ourselves if we're ready to participate in this journey to blend contemplative education with social justice. The transformed vision asks us to recognize cultural patterns of oppression that people of color and other oppressed people can often face and live with the realities of fear and trauma. We have kids right now that are being separated from their parents at the border. We have people right now who are losing sleep in fear that they may be deported. We have so many issues going on right now that almost beg us to use our enlightenment and our strength and our inner strength to help shape a better world for so many who live in fear and who are suffering. This transformed vision of contemplative education is multi-voiced. It incorporates diverse knowledges. It incorporates also theoretical lenses rooted in social justice. And it employs a diverse ecology of contemplative practices that reflect diverse people. And it addresses student outcomes related to social justice. This new vision moves beyond neutrality. It is a social justice that understands that contemplative education for social justice is not neutral. It is not colorblind. It is not devoid of issues of race, color, creed, multiple identities, or emotion. Importantly, it is a movement and can be a movement guided by love, compassion, and empathy. To understand that every revolution behind it has at its core the notion of love, that we're doing this because we care, that we're doing this because it comes from our hearts, because we want to eliminate suffering, because we want people to have a better sense of life and a better sense of living in this world. And so I end by reminding us that we're entering the year of the Firebird. And that year of the Firebird is a beautiful year. It's a symbol of rebirth, of us beginning to say, wait a minute, I need to rid myself of things that aren't working. I need to rid myself of patterns of thinking that aren't working. And at the same time, I need to be open to a new journey of rebirth, of learning new things, of taking risks, of having the courage to do things differently, of walking the path of goodness, of love, of change, of social justice, of helping our fellow human beings. And so I ask us today to soar, to take those risks, and to use all of the tools that we are learning to make ourselves better and more enlightenment, to have that conocimiento, to help guide us to this era of moving contemplative education, to have a center of social justice, because that is the way forward, that is the way that we can help our fellow human beings, that is the way that we can help our society, that is truly the way that we can end suffering in the world. It is truly the way that we can create a transformational miracle that centers social justice and caring and love for the world. Thank you for inviting me. Namaste. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.